Welcome to Postwave. This is Trevor.
And this is Eric.
This is the second part in our two-part series on the intellectual dark web. Just a quick disclaimer that we're two musicians and composers who like to talk about a bunch of topics that are sometimes slightly beyond our wheelhouse. If we say anything that's factually incorrect, or even if you just disagree with us, we really love if you send us an email at postwavepodcast@gmail.com and let us know. So just to kind of tie up the whole Black Lives Matter thing as it relates to the IDW, I think a lot of their main concern was, especially with the whole defund the police thing and protesting in the middle of a pandemic when people have been told to, stay inside and don't congregate and all that stuff. I think the main concern was that would play into the hands of Trump and the GOP because it would seem hypocritical, and the whole like defund the police thing would seem like a really drastic overreaction and something that was obviously not a good idea.
That's funny because it's kind of a right-wing economic approach, right? Smaller government, defund the police, whereas the more democratic socialist approach would be more towards like in developing better systems that more cultivate good practices within the police.
That's interesting. Yeah, I mean in terms of like more money going to the government, I guess. I never really thought about that. Although I don't know. As far as money going to any part of the government, I think conservatives are pretty gung ho about that being directed towards policing and the military. Yeah. I mean, both parties have their things that they're a little bit hypocritical about, as far as like the things that they're like, because liberals are supposed to want the government to control more things, and conservatives are supposed to want the government to control less things. But with things like abortion, the conservatives want to control people a lot more. And there are some things that flip the kind of stereotypical tendencies a little bit.
Yeah, I think the whole dichotomy is bullshit, but that's
right,
maybe another episode.
Yeah. Yeah, I think we kind of mentioned that too.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I have to admit, like I was I kind of had the same concerns when all the protests started. And I personally didn't I didn't go to any of them, mostly out of concern for the COVID thing. And luckily, I mean, there have been a bunch of studies that have been done, and seems pretty safe to say that none of the protests really contributed significantly to any spikes. Not that they didn't cause any new cases, but that there's no correlation between like cities that had gigantic protests and cities that had spikes in COVID cases. And that's due to people wearing masks and social distancing, unlike people who are protesting the lockdowns and not doing any of that stuff. But that said, I think it still could have played into the hands of conservatives a little bit, making the left look hypocritical.
I again, I'm dubious about this, because that kind of thinking is about us versus them. It's about we have to look good so that they can't win against us, or we have to make them look bad so that we can win against them, and completely misses the purpose of having any sort of meaningful dialogue.
sure, but but functionally, with how big of a deal this election was, and how much was riding on it, I think it
Hmm.
was pretty risky to do anything beyond. Uh, I don't know, I think it made sense to play it safe as far as giving
Hmm.
giving the other side, uh, ammunition.
Giving the other side ammunition. I mean, do you see the problem here?
I mean, that's the situation though. Like that's I agree. It's not ideal at all, but but that is the
Do you
situation that
think
the
that's
country is in right now.
naturally the situation, or has that been artificially cultivated by people who want to pit people against each other so that they can more easily control us?
Oh, I think that's totally. I think it totally is. What you said, higher powers pitting people against each other so they can more easily control
Mhm.
us. But again, I think this specific election was just so important. I mean,
Uh,
I think
I mean, I see your point and I agree with you. And when is it ever not going to be that way? And can we ever justify succumbing to vitriol and villainization of a large swath of people in order to just get that one little victory in?
yeah. Well, I realize it's easy to just keep kicking the can down the road and say, oh well, this election's really important, but next time we can try to be a little less partisan or
Mm-hmm.
polarized or whatever. But I I believe fairly strongly that our democracy was actually at risk in this election. Like the whole
Mm-hmm.
system itself was at risk,
Mm-hmm.
and I think that's confirmed by what Trump's been doing for the past 3 weeks. And
What's he
just,
been doing? I haven't been following at all.
oh, good for you. I mean, I just like denying that he lost and saying it
Oh.
was all corruption
Uh-huh.
and you know yeah, it's pretty fucking scary. And the GOP is like going along with it
Hmm.
for the most part.
That's scary.
Yeah, really haven't been following any of
No.
that.
It's all bullshit.
Yeah, I mean, I stopped paying attention once it was clear that everything was going to be okay. But uh, yeah, it was a little touching. I mean, it was the whole like um, technically in a few states the state legislature could just choose to pick the electors themselves,
Hmm.
um, and just ignore the popular vote.
Mm-hmm.
And some states have laws against that, but some don't. And obviously, if any of them did that, it would basically be like a coup.
Yeah.
But it was within the realms of possibility.
Mm-hmm.
That was what everyone was afraid of.
Hmm.
Um, but so yeah, so the COVID thing in connection to the protests ended up not being quite, or it ended up not really being a problem at all. Which I think in retrospect was probably the main thing that concerned me about them, just because I was kind of on the more cautious end of my group of friends, and I
Mm-hmm.
had a lot of friends just going out, and yeah, I was never really sure what to think.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and there were, I don't know if you saw, like there was this petition that went around with a bunch of medical professionals saying that racial injustice and police violence was enough of a public health issue that it justified
Hmm.
protesting. And
Right.
way more people believe that than signed the petition. There were a bunch
Mm-hmm.
of protests in different cities of medical professionals, um, but that petition in particular, it was like 1,500, and which seems like a big number, but compared to the total number of medical professionals in the country, that's like almost nothing,
Mm.
right? And I have to believe that petition like went around like crazy. on social media and stuff. So
I think it's really impossible to judge the amount of support by that just by looking at the proportion of people who signed it versus people who may or may not have been exposed to it.
yeah, yeah. I mean, I may be uh, I may be assuming some things, but I guess what I want to say is that you can't really. I don't think you can really make any conclusions based on the number of people that signed it.
Mm. Yeah, but that maybe it's just an idea to consider, that maybe we don't know the data one way or another, but maybe it's quite reasonable to think that may actually be the case.
What may actually be the case?
That it's justifiable that the amount of lives lost from police violence is greater than the amount of lives lost by people spreading the disease protesting.
Yeah, and like I said, in the end, it was shown that the protest didn't really contribute significantly to the, to the epidemic,
Mm-hmm.
and so yeah, I guess that was borne out. But yeah, at the time that was kind of freaking me out a little bit, just I think because of the side I had landed on from the whole South by Southwest thing, and my mind was just already kind of in that mode.
I think just another thing that's really important to recognize is, while we may create these groupings of people, we are the left, we are the grassroots, or whatever it is, whatever grouping we call ourselves or the other people, that really those are not unified identities, and they're just sort of vague approximations that may or may not realistically reflect the combined values of the people who are purportedly members of them.
Yeah, I agree. So would you describe that as being kind of the opposite of identity politics?
Well, I would say that what we were experiencing is definitely identity politics, and that's not a helpful thing.
Right. And that actually is, I think that's a pretty unanimous stance on the IDW.
Mm-hmm.
And I kind of agree with it. I mean, well, I'll just kind of say what Sam Harris says, which is, I think, the version I agree with the most, which is that, like, there was a need for identity politics at a certain point. But now it's pretty obviously led to white identity politics on the right. Sorry to keep using right and left, but but, like, especially among poor white people, it seems counterintuitive that they can't be proud of their identities in the same way that minorities can, if that makes sense. Which, again, I mean, I totally see why that is, but I totally see why white identity politics is wrong. But from their perspective, I could see how they could think that, if that makes sense.
I'm not sure that we're talking about exactly the same thing.
Yeah.
I guess with my understanding of identity politics, it's the perspective from which it more matters who you are when you're making a decision than what decision you're actually making. For example, there's people who would consider themselves conservative and yet voted for Trump. Now, if you really look at what Trump represents ideologically, he's the most batshit insane liberal. He does whatever the fuck he wants, changing things up for no apparent reason other than, well, whatever. He's not conservative. He is supposedly a big middle finger in the system, right? As Shapiro says in that video.
Yeah. Well, he did kind of hijack the Republican Party.
He did, and that's kind of my point. Because why did actual conservatives vote for this clown? The way I see it, it's because they identify as older, rich, white men who like women and golfing and whatever. It's that image of I'm like him, I'm that person. And so it doesn't really matter what he represents ideologically or what he's actually going to do. The person's going to vote for him because they see that identity.
Yeah, and yeah, I think that's you definitely have a good point. And for people who aren't rich, it's what they want to be.
Exactly, yeah.
And yeah, that not to keep referencing Sam Harris, but he said that Trump is a poor person's idea of a rich person. Like, all the lavish like gold and like really opulent displays of wealth and all that stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And it's all kind of Wizard of Oz type illusion thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because isn't Trump like horrendously in debt?
Yeah,
like
yeah. We don't really know
rich as you can get.
Yeah, we wouldn't really know his financial situation.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, I think also what Trump represents is that kind of like you're saying, the division between Republicans and Democrats doesn't really make sense, and it's starting to break down a little bit because people are just kind of fed up with the system as a whole. And I think for a lot of people who voted for Trump, it was just this, I'm so fed up with the system. Let's throw this crazy guy in there and see if he can, shake things up enough to make things change.
Mm-hmm.
I think that was a lot of people's motivation from what I understand.
Yeah, from talking to people, that's also the impression that I got.
Yeah. So I'm curious, what's your opinion on the whole defund the police thing?
I mean, I guess I would take a more socialist perspective that maybe defunding isn't necessarily the most effective route. For example, this may be a little dated, but I remember from a year or two ago there was some talk about police body cameras, and that these were near unanimously in favor by members of the police when an anonymous survey was taken. I think like 85% of police officers were in favor of mandating that they should have to wear body cameras all the time. And that would maybe be a step in the right direction, which would, cost some money, but it would probably be well worth it.
Yeah, I don't think that's outdated at all. Yeah, I know that's started to be a thing. We have, it has helped in a few cases, I think. Yeah, I mean, anytime you can get video, I think it makes the whole thing a little bit more objective, even if it can definitely, show some things and not other things, depending on the angle or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
But that's also one thing that Coleman Hughes talks about is because most of these interactions that go bad are filmed on cell phones now, like almost as a rule.
Mm-hmm.
It does give us a more objective view of things and let us it's definitely help any time any of these things are caught on camera, as disturbing as it can be to watch.
Mm-hmm. And like maybe that's just one of many steps that could be taken. For example, mental health support for police officers, and like effective training and selection to get like a police officer force who understands some of the more complicated issues and don't want to go out and kill unarmed black people.
Yeah, and it was kind of weird because at the same time there were all these defund the police things going around. There were also, like comparisons of how many hours police have to train versus, I think, like barbers, a bunch of really kind of mundane things.
Mm-hmm.
And it was like, wow, their training is so much lower, like their required training is so much lower. Um, we need to raise the number of hours they need to train, and also like defund somehow. Um,
Yeah.
yeah, and I'll admit, like, I mean, when the uh when George Floyd was murdered, I was initially on the defund the police train,
Mm.
um, and kind of on the whole uh protest train in general, because it seemed like one of those things that those ideas that seems counterintuitive, but I just I trusted that I didn't know enough to be able to make an argument about it,
Mm.
and that I should just trust people who think about this stuff all the time.
Mm.
Um, and yeah, it wasn't really until I ran into that Coleman Hughes article that I think my thinking really started to change. Um, but I think what people sometimes miss about the defund the police thing is that the slogan itself kind of have two meanings depending on who you're talking to. One being we just need to take funding away from the police, and not all of it though, right? Take some funding away and reallocate it to mental health services, that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and the other one being abolish the police,
Ah.
right? And
Hmm.
and there are definitely, for most people who support the movement, I'm sure it's not abolish the police, but there are some people, radical people who believe that,
Mm-hmm.
and that uh, anytime I hear like this is really frustrating. Like anytime I would hear it being the phrase being brought up on like Joe Rogan uh or any of the IDW kind of podcast spaces or whatever, they would never mention the reallocation part
Mm-hmm.
of like redirecting the funds to other things that could help. It was
Yeah.
always just, well, this is so stupid. Why, of course we need police. What do you think is going to happen?
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so I think the whole phrase was just kind of uh, poorly chosen and poorly
Mm-hmm.
uh, promoted, I guess.
Yeah, and that's so challenging because I think maybe the reason why a phrase like that could gain so much traction is because it's catchy, right? It like sounds provocative and it's easy to wrap your head around like the simple core concept of that idea, and yet it maybe it doesn't convey the intention that the people behind it have, and furthermore it may not even represent the ideology as we've just discussed of the people who are saying it. And so you kind of have a bandwagon effect where people repeat it without really understanding it.
Yeah, yeah. Although I think yeah, it's interesting because I feel like most of the people in my friend circle who were sharing those things like definitely did understand it. Um, and yeah, it's weird. I don't know where the disconnect is between those people and the more center people who just think it means get rid of the police.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I think most people who repeated it understood what it meant, but might have miscalculated its
Mm-hmm.
impact in the end, if that makes sense.
Yeah, didn't fully understand the ramifications.
Yeah, or I don't know about understand, but just like misjudged.
Or maybe just didn't consider, it seems to me.
I mean, I'm sure they considered its impact because like you wanted to have an impact, right? But I think they just, I mean, it was kind of, I think it was kind of like an extreme situation calls for extreme measures type thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they realize. I think that's really core to a lot of the way people interact with politics today is that they have a visceral emotional reaction against a situation that is obviously wrong, and they want to do something about it. And so they get up in arms and look for the loudest movement that has the most catchy slogan and just jump on that bandwagon, is like you said, assuming that that's the best thing, that people have thought it through. And maybe the reason why that particular idea has got so much traction is not that it's well merited, but just that it's attractive, that it's flashy.
Yeah, and it lets people, yeah, kind of like you said, it lets people feel like they're contributing in some really tangible way.
Mm-hmm.
Even if it's maybe not quite as much of a contribution as they think.
Yeah, or even if it's something that is doomed to failure and only makes quote unquote your side look stupid.
Yeah. If you're enjoying what you're listening to so far and you want to support us somehow, there's lots of ways you can do that. You can go follow us on Facebook or Instagram, or visit us online at postwavepodcast.com, or send us a nice email at postwavepodcast@gmail.com. You can also follow us on your podcasting platform of choice. We're on pretty much everyone out there. Give us a nice review if you're on a platform that supports that, or a 5-star rating. Thanks for listening. So yeah, I think in the end, like my main issue with the whole Black Lives Matter protests thing isn't so much that I think they're wrong or that the protest shouldn't happen, but again, I think for me it does just come back to I worry that it's gonna provoke like a whiplash on the other side. Because I think, as I said, there's definitely still racism. There's definitely still structural racism and systemic racism in policing, and inordinate violence against people of color by police and all that stuff. I just think, yeah, it's slightly different than the popular narrative would suggest.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point.
I'll also say, like, I was poking around a little more on the internet related to this Coleman Hughes article, Stories and Data, and did you get a chance to read any of it by any chance?
I haven't yet.
Okay. Yeah, so I just like I googled the article and there were a bunch of like Reddit threads about it. And of course people are like, this City Journal, the website that this was published on is what did they say exactly? City Journal is published by the Manhattan Institute, a far-right hate group in the form of a think tank that promotes authoritarian solutions for urban problems. So I feel like this happens a lot with political stuff. Like, you'll read an article that you're really convinced by, and then you'll see someone say, "Oh, well, that was published on this platform," or "This person has also said this other, like, horrendous thing," and then you just kind of doubt everything you felt or thought when you were reading that article, or listening to that person talk or whatever. Do you ever run into that?
So in extreme cases, yeah. I remember there was one article that went around on Facebook with this picture of people from like 100 years ago all stuffed in cages, and it was this like long story about how Irish indentured servants were treated as bad or worse as African slaves. And it's this whole like long in-depth, and you're reading it, you're like, holy shit, is that true? Is this all just been brushed under the rug and hidden by history? And then of course, if you actually examine the data, it's all absolute fabrication, propaganda that's been made up. So I think maybe that's the most important thing in engaging with these ideas, is to be able to address the particular points, the particular data that has been presented, and make judgments on those regardless of if the source you are drawing it from is saying things that you disagree with or that you even think are just abhorrent.
Yeah, I agree in general. Although, um, there are certain, publications that are definitely red flags. I mean, and of course
Mm.
I'm biased against things like Breitbart and I don't know what are the new. There's a couple new like Trump leading news websites,
I don't know.
like One America, and there's a couple other ones that have uh sprouted up that are even more extreme than Fox News, and like any
Mm-hmm.
one of those, I would be highly skeptical of anything I read on there.
Mm-hmm.
Doesn't mean they can't say true things, but uh
Yeah.
yeah, in general, like it's good to just kind of cross reference things and at least see what the criticisms are.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because a clever source like that is going to publish some things of merit in order to disguise the fact that they're pushing a particular untrue agenda.
Yeah, and this has obviously been said before, but I think so much of the political turmoil we're experiencing right now is a direct result of the internet and just how it's completely destroyed our our relationship with the truth that we
Mm-hmm.
had before.
I mean,
And maybe it'll ultimately turn into something better because I don't think it should be controlled by just the big media
mm-hmm.
outlets and all that stuff. But uh, yeah, I think that's a big driver of all the stuff that's kind of going down.
Mm-hmm. And I agree that there's definitely reason to think that, and that may be very true. I'd also question the idea that we ever really had that sort of a objective view of the truth. It's just so much easier to get caught in a rabbit hole now, but maybe before it was kind of just as bad. You just didn't know it because the sources of information were so particularly curated to paint a very particular picture.
Yeah, no, I think you're totally right, and I think if I'm being optimistic, maybe we'll get to some kind of new equilibrium where we will have a little bit better of an idea about truth. But
Mm.
yeah, you're totally right that before we were probably just ignorant of all the things we were being deceived about because everyone was like in cahoots with everyone else.
Mm-hmm. And maybe to be optimistic, an approach we could reach that more objective truth state of being is to encourage literacy in every individual, to create a sort of informational immune system where, like, for example, that post that I was talking about with the Irish indentured servants, I saw it because some older lady who doesn't know anything about how to like fact check things just saw this and was emotionally gut wrenched by it and said, "Holy shit, I need to share this," without having any concept of maybe you should Google it first, see if it's verifiable, see if it's refuted somewhere.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah, you got to be aware of who's who's posting stuff too.
Yeah.
Yeah, but yeah, but given like the right string of people, it's possible for someone you would totally trust otherwise to still post something that's completely
Mm-hmm.
inaccurate.
I guess my hope is that with it becoming so evident and necessary for people to recognize that not everything you read on the internet is true, that maybe people can start to learn as a whole and develop a resilience toward that sort of misinformation.
Yeah, I mean, I think everyone at this point is aware that not everything you read on the internet is true. I think the problem is confirmation bias, and people automatically want to believe that the things they disagree with aren't true, and the things that they do agree with are true.
That's definitely another issue.
Yeah, or at least, yeah, I think it would at least be good for people to accept that, like, no matter the outlet, some things are probably true and some things aren't.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So just one last thing on the defund the police issue. I do think it's pretty plausible that that led to the Democrats not winning as many Senate and House races as they thought they might.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, I haven't examined the data, and it seems like that could possibly have been an effect, but I wouldn't make a statement one way or the other.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, there's a lot of infighting in the Democratic Party about that right now. But I think it's I mean, it was it was people who were in pretty tight races already, and I think a lot of them have like heard directly from voters that that was the issue.
Hmm.
But yeah, it's the whole like how radical should we be, and how should we weigh like actually winning and getting to enact the policies we want versus like standing up very intensely for principles no matter what the
Hmm.
costs are.
I mean, I don't think we have to be concerned about how radical our ideas are, just if they make sense. If they make sense and they're radical, then in a not corrupt system anyway, they should rise to the top.
Yeah, but what do you mean by making sense?
Like, for example, defund the police probably doesn't make sense. It's in contradiction to the other aspects of the solution, like creating cameras and better training for the police. Like, that is not very well thought out. And so, of course, it's going to have a lot of criticism. Whereas if people have a more thought out approach, even if it's radical, it maybe won't garner so much criticism if the people criticizing it are doing so in good faith. And I think we have to kind of assume that even though they are the other, even though they're on the other side, even though they think silly things about abortion, they're probably mostly in good faith, I think, on a lot of points.
Yeah, maybe so. I mean, obviously there's a lot of variation across people as to how much in good faith they are and how much they're just kind of going based on their like religious beliefs or whatever the party
Mm.
says they should do, or how they were brought up.
Mm-hmm.
um but I think that the problem with radical ideas in general is that I mean, like, what does it mean to be radical, right? Like, it means to take some extreme step in the goal, with the goal of like furthering some agenda, right?
Mm-hmm.
And if that agenda is counter to what a bunch of other people want to do, then they're going to see it as like this huge escalation, right?
Sure, and I think it's really important to maybe recognize that we might hold perceptions of this external force of people who are recalcitrant and obstinate, and they just want to derail everyone. And sure, there's some of those people out there, but I think it's a mistake to say that, like, for example, the entirety of the right is in opposition to the idea of reducing police brutality. I don't think that's true at all. I think if you go out and talk to 100 people who consider themselves conservatives and say, hey, if a cop is going to shoot an unarmed black person, do you want to stop that or not? They're going to say, yeah, that's a person with a life and they matter. you know?
Yeah, totally. um yeah, but yeah, they want the same things everyone else does,
Mm-hmm.
right? Just like peace and stability and happiness for as many people as possible.
Yeah, and I think when we engage in identity politics and vilify a large group of people external to ourselves, it makes it impossible to recognize that truth and to come to reasonable conclusions.
Mm-hmm.
Makes us more susceptible to manipulation by people who are trying to pit us against each other.
Right. Right. I still think you're being a little bit too optimistic about people accepting radical solutions that are coming from people they would normally consider their opponents.
I don't
But
know.
I guess your point is that they shouldn't think of them as their opponents,
Precisely.
which I think is a little bit unrealistic because there's even if it's not strict left right Republican Democrat, there's always going to be kind of two or more opposing factions somehow.
Well, I think you may be right, but only because we're being artificially manipulated to be in opposition to each other.
So you think if we weren't being artificially manipulated, there'd be everyone would be in agreement?
Not everyone
Eventually?
would be in agreement, but everyone would be willing to have a discourse and to change their minds, to allow their minds to be changed by actually considering things that other people of other backgrounds are saying and not dismissing them out of hand just because they disagree with you on things that you care about.
Yeah. I mean, that's optimistic. I wish I could believe that was maybe it's like possible theoretically, but I think it's
Look, yeah, I'm not saying that's going to happen. This was specifically in response to when you said if there weren't that manipulating force. That manipulating force is there, and I think it's quite reasonable to say that we've all lost. They have control. There's nothing we can do to stop them pitting the majority against the majority.
right. Well, I guess what I'm trying to say is the manipulating force isn't the only thing creating this division, and it's not the only thing keeping people from not considering things from like a quote unquote objective point of view.
Hmm. I mean, people will always have their shortcomings, but I think the most important deciding factor is to recognize that the majority of people on the opposition do have a good faith intention to try to understand and better the world for the most people as possible. They just are also being manipulated in the same way that you're being manipulated to see them as a ridiculous force that you can't communicate with.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I guess I pretty much agree with that. Yeah, it's just I guess it's more just a question of to what degree is that possible, but that's an open question.
I guess we'll find out, won't we?
Yeah.